Hello again. That last panel was amazing, and I think that it, yesterday in Skip's remarks in presenting David the Du Bois Medal, he mentioned the generations of scholars who were here, and that panel demonstrated what that means exactly. So that was kudos to both Greg and Daniel, of course, but also to Victoria and Gabrielle. That was wonderful. It's my pleasure to introduce Alex Borucki, who is chairing the next panel. He is professor of history, or roundtable panel. Well, looks like a panel now. It's not a roundtable anymore. He is professor of history at the University of California, Irvine, and the author of From Shipmates to Soldiers, Emerging Black Identities in the Rio de la Plata, and co-editor of From the Galeon to the Highlands, pardon the pronunciation, Slave Trade Routes in the Spanish Americas, and co-editor of another volume and author or co-author of many articles in leading journals. He is also, as we heard before, the co-creator with Greg O'Malley of the Intra-American Slave Trade Database, and he is currently writing a book with co-writing a book with Jose Luis Belmonte Postigo, provisionally entitled The Slave Trade and Silver in the Refinancing of the Spanish Empire During the Age of Imperial Fracture. Over to you, Alex. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Abby. Thank you to Kingsley. Thank you to all the nice people here in the Hutchins who have hosting us in this great 2 days. It has been overwhelming in a positive sense, of course. Like, I'm overwhelmed with joy and love. The panel today is entitled Trayectorias Afro, the movement of enslaved and free Africans and their descendants in New Spain, Spanish North America. And different than the previous panels that you have seen, all the presenters have been working together in a single project that I'm gonna present to you, different aspects of these projects. I'm gonna first introduce each of these historians, and there's gonna be a little switch on the order, so compared to the program, and then I'm gonna be speaking a little bit on the beginning about how this project, Trayectorias Afro, came about. So we're gonna have her first, Tatiana Seijas, who is an associate professor of history at Rutgers University, here with us. She writes about global migrations, long-distance trade, urban economies, and the joint history of freedom and slavery. Her forthcoming book, American Metropolis, The Making of Mexico City, reconstructs the lives of ordinary people who created new businesses and sustained their neighbors during the 17th century. And also, she's currently researching and writing the book First Roads, Indigenous Trade and Travel in North America, which recovers the history of native merchants who forged routes of exchange between Mesoamerican highlands and the Rio Grande Valley. So we're getting back to Texas as well. Next, we're going to have in the middle over there in the table, Jorge Delgadillo, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Humanities Institute in Penn State University. His research focuses on the histories of race, slavery, and peoples of African descent in Mexico, particularly Guadalajara, between the 17th and 19th centuries. And his articles have been published in Spanish and English in the journal Historia Mexicana, the Americas, Slavery and Abolition, and he has been a postdoctoral fellow with me in UC Irvine and here in the Hutchins Center for African American Research at Harvard, and he did his PhD in Vanderbilt. Finally, on the end of the table, we are going to have Sabrina Smith, who is an assistant professor of history and critical race and ethnic studies at the University of California, Merced. She specialized in the history of African diaspora to Mexico and Central America, particularly Oaxaca. And she's a co-PI with me and with Greg O'Malley over there of the UC Multi-Campus Research Initiatives, Roots of Enslavement in the Americas. She's currently working on his first book manuscript on African descent women and men in colonial Oaxaca. Also, she's the author of the chapter African Descent Women, Power and Status in Colonial Oaxaca, and has other several books and chapters regarding to the traffic of African descended women in New Spain. So, let's see if this works. Yes. I'm going to be presented today just the introduction of this project that we have been working along with a dozen of other historians who lived in Mexico and here in the United States. Trayectorias Afro, the movement of Afro-descendant people enslaved and free in New Spain. Basically, the greater colonial Mexico, from Guatemala to California. This project came about something in connection with the SlaveVoyages website because of two specific things. One, as you may know, the unit of record in the transatlantic database and the intra-American database is the ship, the slave ship, that moved people from Africa to the Americas and from different ports in the Americas. And this is a great overlapping with our previous panel on the intra-American traffic, the traffic within the Americas. Increasingly, we're having information about individuals in the SlaveVoyages website, on enslaved individuals, but also on the slavers, those who participated in enslaving ventures, captains, owners, merchants, you name it. Still, these two perspectives are on the maritime slave trade, meaning traffic that occur on the oceans, sometimes in the river. But what about the traffic that happened overland, moving people within regions overland in the Americas? And these two things have been reminded to Greg and myself when we presented on the database by Tatiana Seijas over here, when we presented in the AHA several years ago. I'm talking about before COVID times. And always I had in my mind this situation. We know that in Mexico there are several historians who work on specific regions within Mexico and who had worked particularly on notarial records, records of the sale of individual enslaved people from one region to another. Historians on Oaxaca, historians on Puebla, historians on Guadalajara, Aguascalientes, you name it. It was as this that Jorge, in the middle, he was a postdoctoral fellow in UCI, where I teach for a year, and we took that opportunity to discuss this idea of creating and consolidating the work of several historians who live in Mexico and the United States on the movement of people within Mexico using this type of sources, because this was work that has been already done for several regions. So we have to put the people together. At that time, we talked with Sabrina, we talked with other scholars in the United States, and we started to contact our counterparts in Mexico. Our counterparts, especially in the business of organizing historians. and so we contacted the National Institute of Archaeology and History, el Instituto Nacional de Arqueología e Historia in Mexico, Gabriela Iturralde, who is the executive director over there, but also Álvaro Alcántara in Veracruz, in order to participate and bring people together in Zoom gatherings. This is like 2021 that I'm talking, 2022, in order to envision how we could work together and also create trust. If you collaborate on research, you want to collaborate with people who you trust and you feel comfortable collaborating. You know, this is what makes this type of projects really fruitful. At that time also, already in 2022, with Sabrina Smith and Greg O'Malley, we applied for funding in California, the great state of California, for the multi-campus research initiatives with three main goals. One, in expanding the intra-American slave trade database in the Caribbean. Another one, incorporating the Pacific shores of the Americas. California happened to be in the Pacific Ocean, so that was putting SlaveVoyages within the Spanish South America and Spanish Central America. And the third goal is the goal that we are showing you today, creating a database of the movement of enslaved people within the larger colonial Mexico, from Guatemala to California. We started to have monthly Zoom meetings with historians in Mexico and with historians in the United States. And out of those meetings that involved sometimes 20, 25 people, we kept 9 historians who work consistently with us in order to contribute their data and in order to discuss the formation of this database. These historians are Mayra Córdoba, who works on Oaxaca, Jorge Delgadillo, of course, who works on Guadalajara, Luis Juárez, who works on Aguascalientes and Zacatecas, María Irma López on Colima, that's on the Pacific, Julieta Pineda, who works on the states owned by the Jesuit orders, the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church, who own large states in colonial Mexico, Pablo Sierra, who works on Puebla, Tatiana Seijas over here on Mexico City, and Sabrina Smith on Oaxaca. And out of these meetings was that we were able to create this research tool that, as you see from the website, is in Spanish. Call me the colonial if you want. That was the first part of collaborating with historians in Mexico, basically working on the sources and working on the interface that serve the communities that live in Mexico. At some point, a robot is going to translate this into English sooner or later, so don't panic. Okay, now we are going to transition, and I'm going to ask Tatiana to tell us about the sources that make this research tool. Thank you.
Good morning. It's wonderful to see you, to be here. Such a joy to learn from people whose work I admire and whose work I didn't know and I admire now. So, we're doing a roundtable, but I nonetheless prepared a few slides to share my involvement with Trayectorias Afro and show you how I'm combining data from property records and slave voyages to write a biography of a woman from Upper Guinea. Her name in Mexico was Antona. So many of us remember, like Alex just mentioned, that there's been a set of panels at the AHA for I don't know how many years that Daniel and Alex are always organizing. And at one point, Alex and Sabrina started talking about this possibility of employing property records to reconstruct the history of people and their movement in Mexico. And I was just thrilled to be asked to be involved, so thank you for that. So since then, since this project has gotten started, I have shared the data that I collected at the Historic Notaries Archive of Mexico City, which is located in the choir of this church. This beautiful church, you can see it there on the upper register. It was once the first convent for indigenous women in America. And it now holds thousands of volumes of property records, notarized documents, including bills of sale, which attest to the persistence of the institution of slavery from the 1530s through the end of the 18th century in Mexico. So during my dissertation research, I mined such records for enslaved people who lived here in the capital in the 1600s. And that's the data that's been partly uploaded to the Trayectorias Afro database. And so Those of us who do this kind of research, we have Excel sheets before us when we're reading the documentation. And here are some of the entries to give you a sense of the accounting that we were talking about last night. And I brought up a couple of examples. I had a column that noted if the person had experienced the harrowing practice of branding. And so there's an example there. I also wanted to show our colleagues who are working on Mozambique that I encountered many people who were categorized as being from Mozambique. And so here's information of their bills of sale that reference that trade directly. And so usually bills of sale, you get the place of, you don't even get the place of disembarkation. You get the place of sale, the slave owner, the slave seller, the name of the person who's enslaved, their price, their age. But sometimes there are references to other things. And so I wanted to give you a sense of that. Sorry. Here in this detail, you get a sense of this person still being the person's not baptized yet, for example, and he has arrived in a ship that was very much organized out of the House of Commerce in Seville. So this would have been the kind of documentation that ends up in SlaveVoyages through the Asiento records. Now, and here are the people from Mozambique. So, and just here very briefly, I added this slide. These are people who are from Asia, who were the topic of my first monograph. And so here's a shout out to the people who are working on the new database. Here's information that you might find useful in the future once you turn to property records as well. So moving forward, I want to take you to a different place. I was doing research at the Municipal Archive in Morelia, Michoacan, which in the 1600s was called Valladolid. And so there's a map that's showing where Valladolid is to the west of Mexico City, very close to the ocean, to the Pacific Ocean. So I was sitting here in this municipal archive. It's in a room off a large patio, and I found paperwork related to the freedom suit of Antona. So in 1597, Antona petitioned a judge at City Hall to confirm her freedom, which had been granted years prior. She needed the court to protect her and her son, Domingo, from a man who was holding them hostage. Her denunciation is a gripping story of someone who identified as a mother, a wife, and a free person. Antonia described herself as Biafra, an ethnonym that denoted her region of origin. She identified as a person raised in Biafra culture among her people in Upper Guinea, so today Senegal and the Gambia. Antona knew who she was, and she inspired me to learn more about women such as her who survived the Middle Passage during the first century of the transatlantic slave trade. And I started writing her biography. And I've commented on this experience in a special issue of the Journal of Social History on agency, which commemorated Walter Johnson's seminal essay on agency. So Antona disembarked a slaving ship in Veracruz on the map, probably in the 1560s. And from there, a Portuguese slaving agent took her to Mexico City, where he sold her. Data from the Notary Archive, I'm showing here their website, helps us understand the economic context of her sale. There is a partial catalog online for about 10% of the volumes for the 16th century, for those of you who are interested. And these documents show, for example, that the slave owner who manumitted Antona was living in Mexico City in the 1560s, which is how we can estimate the time of her sale. Other documents, such as the bills of sale of Palonia in 1562, categorized as Bran, and Anna from the land of Biafra, testify to this slave market activity. And like I said before, this data from this type of documentation is now part of Trayectorias Afro. So after the purchase, after this slave owner acquired Antona in Mexico City, he took her to his cacao plantation in Zacatula, there on the map, a port town on Mexico's Black Pacific coast. She lived there for several decades, got married, had children. She lived in a cacao plantation such as this one, kind of sketched out on a map. These cacao plantations lined the waters that streamed into the Pacific. They were interspersed with Native American towns that also grew cacao. Antona would have been at the cacao plantation when the English pirate Cavendish made landings up the Pacific coast from Guatemala to northeast Mexico. So I am using this map and associated documentation to write a chapter that contextualizes this period of her life in the context of pirating economy that joined the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. As many of you here today, I'm always trying to link our oceans. So around 1591, she convinced the slave owner at the plantation in Zacatula to grant her manumission. After he died, another slave owner kidnapped her and her son and took them to Valladolid. So her fight for freedom at court, right, the one I described, I showed you her petition, that's when that began, her freedom fighting began in Valladolid. Now, imagine her time way before she landed in Veracruz, her trajectory from Africa, traveling down to the coast, boarding a ship, crossing the ocean, landing in Veracruz, crossing Mexico. It is so very far. Data from SlaveVoyages documents the arrival of about 59 slaving ships in New Spain, Veracruz, between 1550 and 1575. Antona was on board one of them. I will have to do more research following up on the leads of SlaveVoyages to identify the details of her passage and write this section of her biography. But it is one more example of the value of this incredible database. So these two databases, Trayectorias Afro, SlaveVoyages, they are enabling me to identify historical actors and articulate their history. They are complementary to one another. Thanks to all of you who have contributed, the history of Mexico's Black Pacific remains somewhat uncharted waters, in reference to the conference's theme. I hope that Antona's story can lay out a map for further study and further collaboration. Thank you.
Works. Okay. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be back. So today I am going to talk to you about the process of creation of the variables that we are using for the database. I am going to be showing you the different versions of the database leading up to the current state of the project that is the subject of Sabrina's presentation. Okay, so as Alex Borucki mentioned, my participation in the project began in 21-22 when I was a postdoc at UC Irvine working with him. He invited me to participate in this new database in which we would track people of African descent descent, either free or enslaved. At that moment, I already had a database that I created for my doctoral dissertation. I was interested in measuring the slave market in Guadalajara, trying to understand if slavery declined in the second half of the 17th century, who was buying and selling enslaved people, where did enslaved people come from, and so on. So I had a set of variables that you can see here that provided information about both enslavers and enslaved people, like origins, ages, sex. They use this concept of calidad, that it can be translated as quality. So it was a way to refer to these categorizations. So for example, in the bills of sales, they would write quality black, quality mulatto, quality morisco, and so on. So these categories were really local specific, and the categories used in one place might be different in some other place. So it was important to keep record of this. So using this as a starting point, we created a new set of variables after having conversations and meetings with the group, and we came up with 59 variables initially. These variables included, so the idea was to put all of our individual databases into one single spreadsheet, because each of us had their own spreadsheet. So the idea was to put everything into a single general database. So some of these variables include what we called event ID. So each document, a bill of purchase, a manumission, last will or testament, it's an event or document, and we assigned an ID for each of those. Then within those documents, we also assign an ID to every person in the document, both enslaved people and enslavers, so we can keep track of them. We also included variables for enslaved people's origins, or the ethnonyms that are recorded in these documents. I think they were mentioned in the previous panel, Angola, Congo, Biafra, Bran, and so on. The quality, the calidad that enslavers also recorded, black, mulatto, morisco, lobo, coyote. So there are many, many categories like that. So we included those as well. Then at that moment, since we were working on a spreadsheet on Excel, we included a space for different people involved in these documents. So you can see there person number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, because we realized that many of these documents were more complicated or more complex than we initially thought. And it wasn't the case that there was one buyer and one seller. So many times there were multiple buyers, multiple sellers in one single document. There were intermediaries, consignees. So that's why we included all of those variables to know about these people. And again, all of them include sex, origin, occupation, quality. We have their status. So in the Spanish world, they use the honorific of don or doña for women that can reveal information about enslavers and about their position in the social hierarchy. Then, after further conversations with the group, we decided to focus more closely on the movements of people, and we added 26 more variables. So including, for example, the situation of enslavers in a specific place. They use a whole terminology to refer to that aspect. For example, vecino, that can roughly be translated as a head of household. And that was like the highest degree of stability for a person in one place. It meant that that person had a house. It was well known he or she was well known in the community. He or she had established relations in that community, so it was well established. Then we have people who were residents, who might live in a community for long periods of time, but not necessarily have a house or a business or something like that, were not heads of household. Then another word that they used was estante, so meaning someone who was staying in a place, but who might not be originally from there, who might not own a house, who might stay in that place like temporarily. And finally, they also use the phrase de paso, so passing by a specific place. Those phrases are mentioned in the bills of purchase or in different documents. So people who were passing by a specific city, they might either buy or sell an enslaved person. So using that information, we can get clues about the movement of enslaved people in particular, assuming that enslavers were bringing with them enslaved people to the places to which they moved. So we also added variables of the places, the previous places in which enslaved people were, and the places to which they were moved. So we also included that in this version of the database. In this version, we also included variables about physical features that are included in some documents, not in all of them, about markings. Sometimes enslaved people were branded, either on the face, on the chest, on the shoulder, so we keep record of that. Also about their adaptation to Hispanic culture. That was a variable that we originally named Hispanization. Oh, no, I thought you were going to say something.
We were just talking.
Okay. Variables about behavior. That was something that enslavers noted in the bills of purchase. They were actually obligated to note if there was something that they considered wrong with the enslaved person. So if someone tended to escape, to run away frequently, they noted that in the documents. If they drank a lot, they noted that. If they had a disease, were sick, they lacked, I don't know, a finger, a hand, or something like that. So they noted all of that. And we created a variable as well at that moment in the database. And I think finally, in our latest conversations, we separated the variables for behavior and health condition, because in the document, sometimes they are included in the same piece of information. Sometimes they were called tachas or defects. And we decided to separate those as different variables for health condition and for behavior. We also, the variable for Hispanization, we recently changed the name, and now we call it adaptation and agency. And I think lastly, we included a variable for the marital status of enslaved people and enslavers. We were noting that many of the buyers or sellers of enslaved people in different places were widows, and that was something we wanted to keep record of. And with that, I think I end my participation. And, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. All righty. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. All right, I'm going to focus, actually build on what Tatiana has, this beautiful story that you put together and the background that Jorge has offered us. I'm Sabrina Smith. One, I want to thank all of the organizers, thank the Hutchins Center for creating this beautiful space for us to gather and learn about each other's research. So I want to showcase our website, right? You've heard a lot about the background and the stories, the narratives that can be reconstructed using this data. And so I want to build on what Jorge mentioned earlier, and he was talking about, and Tatiana did as well, the work that we've done using Excel, right? And in the last year or so, we shifted from working on Excel to using a Python web-based framework called Django. And so I have to thank our colleagues with SlaveVoyages, and particularly John Mulligan. Huge shout out to John, as well as Juan Covo at UC Santa Barbara, who heads Neo Granadina. Both of them, along with other colleagues, have helped us streamline this process of building a database and also now a website. We're hoping to, and Alex hinted at this, to link this project with other outstanding digital humanities projects on both sides of the US-Mexico border. So in Mexico, we've been in conversations with Memorica, right, which is run by the National Archive. And maybe at some point in the future, SlaveVoyages can, offer a link to our database. We'll see how that works out. So let me walk us through the database. The first thing that you might notice here on the landing page, obviously we have a map in the background, right? We have the name, Trayectorias Afro, and a sort of longer description of the name, the movement of free and enslaved people in New Spain, right? What's most obvious here is this is a Spanish language database. But as Alex mentioned, in the future, ideally, we would be able to offer translations into English and other languages if needed. But initially, as a concept, this was designed to be a database for researchers, students, teachers, scholars, I would think across the Americas. I mean, I know initially it was Mexico, but across the Americas, because we have people who study this topic from Canada, the United States, all the way as far south as Chile and Argentina, right? So Spanish language is sort of one way in which we distinguish ourselves from SlaveVoyages. You'll notice there's a Google type search bar here, which is very simple to search by key terms. And if we scroll down, you'll notice that we have analysis essentially at two levels, at the level of an enslaved person or a free person. I mean, the enslaved category is pretty self-evident. And you would think that free people refers to enslavers, which, as Jorge mentioned, for the most part, that is the case. But that might also include family members or community members who were free African-descended people who purchased the freedom of their family members or relatives. So that has come up not very often, but every so often in the notarial records and parish data that we're working with. We have a section which is essentially an About Us. At this time, I'm nervous to click on this because the website has been a little finicky in the last few days, so bear with me. Okay, good. So it offers a bio on all of the contributors, and I'll come back to the conversation of contributors in just a moment because the data that we're working with is then reflecting the type of information that we can study, at least at this time. And then at the bottom of the database, we have a couple of options to conduct an advanced search. Ideally, at a future point, users will be able to build visualizations, a geographic map. I created something very rudimentary for today, and we will not provide the digitized historical records, at least for now. Not at all, actually. So that's a little bit of what the landing page looks like. At this time, there are 2 or 3 types of visualizations that users would be able to see. So that looks probably very small for some folks. But essentially, we're looking at the distribution of the data according to gender, and as Jorge mentioned earlier, Hispanicization, this category that sort of refers to the extent of acculturation to Hispanic society, right? Whether people spoke Spanish language, wore Western dress, et cetera. And so as we're looking at here, we have category of Creole, right? American-born captives. The problematic term of Bozal, meaning African-born, and then a myriad of other categories that refer to sort of anything in between there. The most glaring and obvious feature here is that many of the captives, if not most, were American-born individuals, right? We see similar representation in the table at the bottom. And then the third type of visualization, here it is representation of enslaved individuals across space and time, meaning what particular locations, where do we find the enslaved people, in which locations, right, at what particular moments in time. One of the obvious things here is that we see large bubbles pre-1650, right, and then at the tail end or late 17th century, right? Pre-1650, we see large representations or an over-representation of Puebla, that's in central Mexico. That represents the data that our colleague Pablo Sierra at the University of Rochester has contributed, but also Guadalajara, the work of Jorge, Mexico City, Colima, a myriad of locations, right? That aligns with, for the most part, the height of the transatlantic traffic to New Spain. I mean, just to give you an example, our colleague Pablo has upwards of 20,000 bills of sale for this period, just for the city of Puebla. We'll figure out how to upload all of that information to the database. So after 1640, we see a drop and then a rise again, right? What does that drop represent? Well, 1640 is that important year where we have the separation of the Spanish and Portuguese crowns, which effectively has cut off Spain from the transatlantic traffic, right? So we see a decline, I would argue not an end, but we see a decline of transatlantic traffic, but then a rise in the interregional traffic of enslaved people, for the most part, American-born, which is what we see here, right? So now we see an overrepresentation of Antequera, which is the the provincial capital of Oaxaca in southern New Spain. Still Mexico City through Tatiana's data, Guadalajara, as well as other locations. So, and that comes through here in the table below. So what I do want to point to is the representation of these locations does not mean that slavery and slave trafficking did not exist in other locales of the colony, right? For instance, the northern frontier, right? That very much did exist there. It's simply the nature of the data, what it's showing us right now is what we have uploaded to the system so far, right? As more folks contribute data, this would obviously look a little bit more widespread. Okay, so that's the front end of the database. I'm now going to switch to, give me just a moment, the back end. And for this part, I'm relying on screenshots. That's not it. There we go. But ideally, I want to do full screen. 1 second. But I want to show you the back end, and the website has been so finicky in the last few days that I found it easier to just complete screenshots and show you that. Thank you. I'll just work with this. Here we go. So, thank you. So, this is the back end of the database. We see here we have 2,746 documents that have been entered into the system. That includes 3,228 individuals, enslaved individuals, as well as 4,281 enslavers. So let that sink in by way of greater number of enslavers than enslaved people, and 25 different institutions, which are also enslavers for the most part. They're religious institutions. So if you were to actually click on Iniciar to enter the database, you will notice we have a long list of records that we have entered into the system with very short descriptions. That ended up being one of the variables that we early on talked about of what would that summary look like, how long would it be. I want to look into one particular example here. It's a record that I've input into the system, so I know it quite well. And you'll see that essentially cross-referencing what Jorge discussed earlier, we have data that's been entered at essentially 3 or 4 levels. The level of the document, as you can see at the top, the level of an enslaved person, and in just a moment I'll talk about the level of enslavers and institutions. Now, at the level of the document, essentially, this is all the information that was attached to a source where you might find that particular record, as well as the brief description. In this case, we have a merchant, Juan Ruiz de la Madriz. He sold 7 African-born captives. We named them. And in this case, I flagged the source because they formed part of an armazón, a larger group of captives, 53 specifically, who were transshipped, or at least transported forcibly overland from the port of Veracruz to the valley of Oaxaca. At the level of an enslaved person, we have all of that qualitative information, the rich characteristics about an enslaved person entered in this case under Domingo, under Francisco, under Pedro. What Jorge was referring to earlier by way of geographic locations, we've flagged where we might find the enslaved person before this particular transaction and after, if we're able to identify that. So all 7 of these individuals, you only see 3 here now, all 7 of these individuals were at one point in time in Veracruz, and then later in the city of Antequera, the provincial capital of Oaxaca. That will enable us to build, ideally, maps of the individual movement of these captives. In addition to that, we have worked on relationships, right? Trying to find any types of relationships, whether that's familial or in this case temporary. All 7 people were sold together in one particular transaction. There are times where family members come up, not in this particular source, but another one that I'll talk about in just a moment, involving a couple of these people here. At the level of enslavers, similarly, we have qualitative data by the end of occupation, location of residence, much of what Jorge discussed earlier, as we see here. And then there's the unique category of an enslaver or free person's role within a document. So here we see Juan Ruiz de la Madriz was the otorgante. He initiated the transaction. He was the seller. Rodrigo Ortiz was the buyer, and Pedro de Guandulain financed this purchase. As we see more complex cases of bills of sale, obviously we would have many more people involved in this sort of network of relationships. And in this particular case, there are no institutions mentioned, but that would appear at the bottom if that were part of the transaction. Okay, so now I'd like for us to look at a particular example, if time permits. I think we're good, okay. And I want to take the example, actually I'll go back 2 slides, of Pedro Gracia, which Pedro actually appears here at the top, and his wife Maria. Let's go up a couple slides. So, they ended up eventually having a son named Antonio. And so Pedro and his wife were forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean on the San Francisco Javier vessel, which, as you can see here, I've identified on SlaveVoyages. For what we see here, approximately 630 individuals embarked the slave ship in what at least SlaveVoyages is indicating in the general region of Congo North. The local records from Oaxaca have labeled nearly all 53 people in that armazón that I discussed, including Pedro and his wife, as coming from the port of Luango. So, you know, that is where we see a little bit of the discrepancy between local records and commercial data. So, my apologies for the historically inaccurate map, but the database unfortunately wasn't quite ready by today to be able to, you know, build a map of the movement of these individuals. So I kind of quickly put this together last night. I spent the last week trying to work with ArcGIS, and I feel that every time I work on it, too much time has passed, and then I'm a novice all over again. So we'll work with this for today. All right, so the 53 captives, which again formed part of the 630 who were on the San Francisco Javier, crossed the Atlantic from some point in West Central Africa, potentially Port of Luango, and crossed all the way to the port of Veracruz. This happened in 1681. They arrived in New Spain in fall of 1681. I don't have an exact date just yet. But what we're seeing here, I then want to trace the overland movement. They would have entered the colony through the port at the fortress at San Juan de Ulua, that then would have crossed into the city of Veracruz, potentially spent a couple of weeks there, 2 to 3 weeks, as slave traders dealt with and figured out the logistics of overland traffic of this large group of captives. Turns out that about 600 disembarked, so 30 lives were lost at sea. So they spent a couple of weeks in Veracruz, and then begins the overland journey, which they departed Veracruz in November of 1681. That journey, as you see through the dotted line here across the colony, would have taken about 2 to 3 weeks. Now, I do know, actually, based off of our colleagues' work, well, Tatiana and Pablo's work, that there were 2 to 3 royal roads, primary roads, connecting the port of Veracruz with central Mexico. One of these crossing through this town here, Orizaba. From records that I'm looking at here, notarial data, as well as travel accounts, it seems that much of the journeys from central Mexico or from the Atlantic port of Veracruz would cross through Tehuacan before heading south all the way down to Antequera in the valley of Oaxaca. So again, that journey would have taken some 3 to 4 weeks. We're talking about a group of captives of 53 people, including Pedro, and who would later be his wife. They traversed and dealt with hot, humid climates in the lowlands near the port of Veracruz and extremely freezing temperatures, ice and snow at the highest elevations as they crossed the Sierra Madre mountain range, all the way arriving in Antequera in December 1682. In the present day, by the way, Antequera is called Oaxaca de Juarez, which is what you see over here. So they arrive in Antequera in December 1681. They must have stayed there for a period of time. That's Pedro and his wife that I'm referring to, because then they were resold all the way south in Zimatlan in May of the following year. So some 5 months or so later. Within a matter of 5 years, by 1687, Pedro and now his wife and now their 1-year-old son, Antonio, were then resold back in Antequera. So that means they journeyed back to the provincial capital of Antequera. Now, the records don't specifically indicate the type of labor that they provided in either of these locations, in Antequera or Zimatlan, but I do know that they were sold to a plantation owner, a sugar plantation owner in Zimatlan. So, and this was a sugar producing region. We might deduce that they were involved in the production of sugar. And then they were involved in, urban slavery in Antequera, which might involve domestic labor, personal service, and such, either in public or private settings, right? I'm thinking of enslaved women who sold merchandise in stores, tiendas, or in the tianguis, that sort of nature. Okay, so the point of this is to offer a little bit of insight in which we can map the movement of an enslaved person, right? This database is very much about mobility, hence the name Trayectorias, Afro. It's geographic mobility within this colony of New Spain, but that also refers to changes in life stages, trajectories, right? That's literally what it means. Changes in legal status of an enslaved person. Some of these documents might be manumission letters that we enter into the system. So I just want to remind us of that. I think that the Spanish language database complements outstanding projects like SlaveVoyages, right? By focusing at the level of an individual, not a vessel, but also focusing on the overland movement as opposed to, transoceanic or movement by riverways. As I might have hinted at earlier, this website is very much under construction still, so we do hope to have it available to the public by the end of this calendar year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabrina, Tatiana, Jorge. And now we are open for questions of the audience, particularly if there was somebody who haven't had a question yet. That's what I do when I teach and I see somebody who starts always. Go ahead.
Fascinating. A question really, I think, directed more towards Tatiana, because I'm interested in Antona. And I'm wondering if you can give me some sense of the potential that what you're doing has to our understanding of free populations of color. I mean, I'm very interested in this group in Mauritius in particular, and I don't know much about them in the Spanish Americas, but they can be, right, a singularly important community within the larger population. And so I would just appreciate any kind of elaboration you might be able to make about the potential for our understanding this particular community better.
Great. Thank you, Richard, for the question. I think the focus on individuals such as Antona does allow us to make that kind of elaboration of community networks in any one place. Antona found herself in the capital of that province in Valladolid, now Morelia. And we know that she right away kind of found a community of people that helped her be able to pursue her freedom suit. So she was probably selling, food at the market. So she would have, made alliances with fellow African women at the market, Native American women at the market, and they helped her get people to testify on her behalf that she was indeed a free person. So it is by joining community, fostering community in any one place that people find themselves in, that that possibility of pushing through a freedom suit is made possible. So yes, in a lot of places, everywhere that we study, there are people who go from being in the enslaved category to being free people. Everywhere there are communities of free people and enslaved people, but oftentimes, there are no distinctions within the community. Being enslaved or not being enslaved does not separate communities. So that's something that I wrote a lot about in this book that's coming out on Mexico City. So I can tell you a lot more about community building in Mexico City. But it is through that lens of individuals that I have kind of been able to map out community making.
Great. John?
I think Daniel's first.
I saw you first.
You're the moderator. All right. So you spoke about linking from SlaveVoyages to your project, which is fabulous. Right? My question, though, is, so if you start, like in some occasions, you'll have a really specific record of an individual who you can tie back to a specific voyage. Or you'll have a record of a person who you have a time span, as you were showing, right? And when you've got that fuzziness, right, then it's not a matter of linking, right, but it's a matter of making some kind of interoperable search that can allow somebody to get, like, to start seeing what the possibilities are, what you do, right, but making it a bit, making it easier for civilians to use, right? So I'm thinking about that in terms of interoperability, and my question on that one is, what would you all like to see, ideally, if you had all the money in the world, to repeat someone from the other day?
We don't.
I know. But what would you like to see? What would be the most effective ways of doing those sorts of searches for you and maybe for the public, right? And then the second one is, you said and I couldn't quite tell the tone of your voice, but it sounded sort of like resignation or fear that you weren't going to make the digital documents available. So my other question with interoperability is anybody? Because there's so much in them, right, that maybe you haven't been able to capture. And there's that authenticity that comes from being able to see those sources. Are the libraries, perhaps? Do you have a Google Drive filled with these things? I'm done.
Yeah, I'm happy to touch on that. Thank you, John. All great questions, by the way. I'll tackle your last question first, and Alex, feel free to chime in if you wish. The reasoning for not providing the documents, there's, I think, two reasons. One is the database was not designed to replace the work of going into the archive, right? In many ways, SlaveVoyages is an exploration tool, right? We already found, or I found, one little discrepancy there between what local records are stating as the point of origin of the 53 captives versus, records, which I cross-referenced those, and they came from travel accounts with the case of the San Francisco Javier. Secondly, it's legal rights of access to those particular digitized images. We all have them, right? Or we have transcriptions of the records. It would be lovely to offer maybe a collection of sources as a sample, but I think we might run into sort of like legal issues by way of copyright laws. We're talking about documents from another country as well, right? I don't know, Alex, do you want to?
And also who are in several different archives, because these are provincial notaries who are in different states within Mexico. Mexico is big. It has many states. And each state has a notary as well. And we have talks with the National Archives in Mexico. We have very productive talks about whether helping to host or helping to connect their digital initiatives with this digital initiative, and also with digital initiatives of the INA, the National Institute of Archaeology and History. And we are trying to make the better good for everyone, but for that you have to talk with everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the IP, right, is obviously like a huge sticking point. But the other 2 points you raised, I think, make a really good case for making them available. If they're all over the place, then it's hard to go to all the archives. And if you have data disagreements between sites, then it would be great to be able to put eyes on the document.
Mm. So one of the things that I really have enjoyed in being part of this collaborative project is making it so that we are all very much available for people to use as a reference. So I can imagine, people maybe reaching out to me in terms of documentation. And the National Archive of Mexico has digitized many, many collections. And they are now online, and people can go and read them. They're not microfilm, they're like proper digitalizations, which is very exciting. All of Inquisition has now been fully digitized, almost all of Inquisition, which is like 1,800 volumes.
Volumes. No?
And, there are enslaved people and free people from Africa in almost all of the volumes. So we have such a rich trove of documentation. So I can see that as being a relatively easy link, because there's already at least like a proper digitization. But at the Notary's Archive, they don't even let you take photographs. It is an impoverished little archive. The one in Colima, I've been there. It's like a room that's like this size. It's boxes. They want you to take transcriptions and leave as quickly as possible.
And they are super nice.
They're very, Colima's not a
They are seeing us.
Yeah, maybe in Coahuila, it's a little bit harder, Coahuila. So I agree, I would support that, but the logistics, I think, are challenging, and we'll have to continue working towards that. When I went to the archive for my first time, my forever advisor said, "Don't you come back with photocopies. You sit there and transcribe." I'm like, "Yes, professor." And I have been transcribing since then. But now I do force myself, if possible, to take a photograph of the document at these little tiny archives, with the hope that someday we'll be able to kind of make that linkage. But you asked a very important question about what could be done, like what I could imagine in terms of the linkages. And if there could ever be a possibility for the collaboration of, if we have people in property records that we can associate the way that Sabrina did with an armazón, with a shipment. And then we can then facilitate a way to link back to the voyage, right? So that we can maybe connect people who were who were on the same ship. You know, there are all kinds of possibilities that we can do to really kind of have the paperwork support history making. But, you know, again, a lot of things are possible with a lot of people and a lot of funding. So, you know, here's to what comes in the future. I am just so excited that now we're like incorporating the Pacific, Asia, and the world of the Indian Ocean. That it's just, I'm beyond thrilled.
Great. Daniel, you were to...
Yeah, I was just wondering if the example you gave and the discrepancy between slave voyages and the notarial records, and considering that we have 2 slave voyages researchers in this project.
It can be the two things true.
Okay.
But I'm not going to interject myself.
Would it be able to maybe have someone to fix slave voyages?
Yeah, of course.
All right, thank you.
Of course. But I will actually, since you brought that up, and this is a follow-up to John's point earlier, I had written down yesterday a few of our challenges that we're dealing with. This is more technical stuff, which is why I bring up John. On the question of linking, or what would we like to see, what would we envision for a connection between these 2 projects. One of the major challenges, I think, right now that the programmers and Alex and I are dealing with is we have a lot of duplication of the same names, right? I mean, there are hundreds of Marias of enslaved people. And so how do we distinguish one Maria enslaved person from another, or one, Antona from another Antona, right? And we, as the scholars who have, and even grad students, because we have a couple of grad students as well, right, who have worked with these documents, we're able to distinguish it because we spent countless hours with the documents, but a typical user will not have that connection. So how on the back end can we link that, and then thinking of the second layer of linking it to, transoceanic movement. I don't have an answer to that. That's just something that's been lingering in the back of my mind for a while.
Great.
Yeah.
Yes, I have a question about self-identification, because my experience interacting with Latinos is that there's so many different names, classifications. Somebody may call themselves mulatto, but they maybe are more like negro, and then you have like Zambo, and you have, so how are you guys dealing with this, and what are some of the parameters you have put together?
You want me to?
So I can speak about that from the choices I have made as a historian. So in the categorizations of color that are used, the ones that you refer to, were used at the time in an extremely derogatory manner. What they mean when you translate some of these terms are, it's kind of like a horrifying description of people. So I have now made the choice not to use them. I know that they're in the records, but I now only write about African and African descended people. And I know that that's also very flattening, right? Because African descended. But I know I will always mark if it's a geographical reference. I have stopped marking the color reference because so many times those words are just so violent that I don't want to write them down anymore.
Yeah, they do appear in the database, though, to be fair. So I think there's distinctions methodologically across this, 9, 10 scholars, right? And I'm with Tatiana on this, that there's much more damage that is happening in us using these, or reproducing these same terms that appear in the historical record. Yet with that said, we're trying to document, what we are able to gather from the historical record as well, right? So it's a difficult balance. And at least in my cases of working with notarial data, the enslaved individuals aren't self-identifying, right? This is based off of the observation of a notary or an assistant to a notary, that there's inherent damage happening right there in and of itself, the recording of the record, right? So it's certainly something to continue thinking about. Thank you for the question.
And in the database also, we provide with additional text as flat pages explaining the categories. Or for instance, noting that some of these categories are not Mexico broad, I mean across Mexico. It may mean something in Veracruz, but it may mean something different in Guadalajara, as well as these are locally based, indeed. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the presentations. I think my question relates to Sabrina's multiple Marias and Antonas. And the question I wanted to ask is, what percentage of the African-born people that you're finding in the databases have reference to their African names? Just because I think it could be really interesting also for us to understand the movement on the African continent, because a lot of the kingdoms had particular names, so you would know how much they had to move to get to the point of embarkation, and that might be really interesting. So just a sense of what percentage of these people, when you're documenting, actually also make reference to their names on the African continent. I mean, I'll give you an example. When I went to Dominica, there's a place called Jacko Steps. And when I was speaking to the guide over there and they told me the name, I was able to say, well, this sounds like a Mende name. And it's not something that's in the records for them. But because I grew up in West Africa, I was like, well, I mean, that name sounds like, so they would have come from here. Whereas, yeah, so it's dormant. It's information that could be dormant, but could come alive within certain contexts. And it's just interesting to know how much of it we have.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it varies across regions, literally, and time. So I'd love for Tatiana to talk on central Mexico. For Oaxaca, I find that the further away we're getting from the Pacific and Atlantic ports, and the further forward in time, the less likely we are to find that type of information. So the notarial records from Oaxaca, for instance, rarely mention, I mean, for the most part, I'd say maybe 75% are American-born individuals, so it's a minority of African-born. But for those who are African-born, they might just mention the port of Luango, as I indicated in the case of the 53 people, Angola, Congo. That's so broad, it'd be difficult to label it to a particular location in West Central Africa. But it's quite different in Central Mexico, right?
Yeah, I wish that the names are lost so much of the time. Supposedly you had to be baptized and given a Christian name before you could be sold. So unless the person was asked what is your other name, it doesn't appear in the records. But you make a good point. The documentation that I have for the coast, for people who disembarked in Acapulco, when people did have a chance to self-describe, they would give their name. They had, Muslim names. They had, not Maria or Luis or all the other Christian names that they were given, and they always detailed where they were from, like what town, what city they were from. So, I'm from Goa, and my name is, Palawi or whatever. So, but then once it gets to the big markets, right, where the slave markets are huge, so hundreds of people are sold every day, the records only give the first name, not even a last name. Yeah.
So sometimes this type of things appears in one type of parish records, in marriage files or information about you being single if you wanted to marry, and there is a little bit more about those specific African names or shared passages between Africa and the Americas or within the Americas of people who share those experiences of passages.
I have a community engagement and ethics question.
Yeah.
Is there, as a project, have you I'm interested to know how you've thought through sort of the ethics of naming names and whether in general there's community engagement and excitement about having people's ancestors listed on a public website, or whether there are some ethical concerns that might come up in terms of people who might not want the information to be made public. I know in some contexts that does come up, but in other places in the Atlantic world, people are very excited for the genealogy to become very accessible. And in other places you have some reservations. I just wonder if as a project, have you reflected on the ethics of the naming of names?
Well, these Zoom meetings that we have on a monthly basis, we do also with people in the INA, this National Institute of History and Archaeology, that is the office regarding research of Afro-Mexican populations. And we have not do specific presentations within Mexico yet outside of this group, but this group also is highly engaged in the group of scholars in Mexico that we talk, I highly engaged with talking.
Community initiatives.
With
yeah.
community
and we will. I mean,
initiatives.
there's talk about moving forward in that
Yeah.
direction. There's also, the issue of how does one identify one's ancestor when it was 400 years ago and the name on the record is just Antonia? It's really difficult to then be able to map out that genealogy
With
and
a
that
combination with
ancestry.
parish records.
But it's possible.
Yes.
But genealogy in this country, in other countries, is people are really active in it. Not so much in other countries. That kind of deep genealogy is not really like a cultural practice as much. But we need a lot of genealogists.
Yeah.
I'm always so impressed by
happy.
the level of research that these people do.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, and actually I wanted to show the website one more time really quickly because I personally forgot to mention this during the presentation. The conversations around the categories that we're using, if I can go back to here. There we go. Perhaps I need to refresh this, but Trayectorias Afro is sort of the shortened term of the website. Not sure why it's not loading the rest of the name, but following Afro was Afro-Mexicano, Afro-Novo-Hispano, Afro-Indígena, there's another, Americano. There's 4 or 5 different categories. Because this question around self-identification, whether it's in the past or the present, is quite complex for both ends, right? And in Mexico specifically, with the 2020 census incorporating Black racial classifications, it became all the more even important, right? So these Afro-Mexican, Afro-Americano might be ways in which, as contemporary individuals, we refer to the past, right? But I would also add that for the African-descended populations in Mexico today, at least in Mexico City, you have 2 classes of folks who might be descendants of the populations that we study, but also folks who are either recent arrivals or first or second generation Mexican, right? Where their parents came from Senegal or other parts of West Central Africa. I'm thinking of Maria Elisa Velázquez's son, right? As well as some of our other colleagues. So it's certainly something to continue to work toward, right? And think about the ways in which we're identifying these populations, both by means of the database, but also just even the landing page, and how we're interacting and engaging with the local communities.
And one last question before we go into lunch.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
So my experience talking with Afro-Mexicans is that they have told me that when they meet other Mexicans and they say, yes, I'm Mexican too, that, most of the, let's say, the typical stereotype of what a Mexican is, who a Mexican is, they say, no, you're not Mexican, and they don't believe that these people are from different parts of Mexico. And so I'm wondering, is there any type of, do you think that doing like a genetic type of study would be something that might be welcomed in present-day Mexico?
They are doing already genetic studies that we presented. I didn't present it. Cesar presented. When was? Which day we are? On Friday?
Thursday.
Thursday. Yeah, it was on Thursday. And actually, it showed like a high, within Afro-Mexican population, a high variance of mitochondrial DNA from Senegambia, broadly speaking, which was a surprising connection with how the movement of enslaved Africans to Mexico during the colonial period work. But this project actually is the result of having a really good institutional and intellectual community within Mexico working on this, who are working also on the ground on Colima, in Veracruz, in Aguascalientes, in Mexico City, and who are engaging with the communities and with the students as well.
There's a National Genetic Institute, and I have colleagues who work there, archaeologists, who work also with public health officials to go to small communities, gather genetic evidence, but also do something in return. You can't just go to towns and be collecting data, right, from people. So in all of these initiatives, because it's federally funded, the communities are part of the conversation of whose genetic information is, what's going to happen to the genetic information, and there's usually like a kind of a clinic that is established in some of these small towns. So it's a different setup than what we're used to in terms of genetic testing in the United States. There it's definitely being done through public funding, as well as individuals. I have 23andMe, and you'd be surprised what my genetic background is really strange.
Yeah, because there is the history of African Americans coming from Texas into Mexico.
Yeah. Alice
To
Baumgartner's
escape
book.
slavery. And, I have like a Mexican friend. I look at them and I don't see anything black about them, but they're talking about how they believe that their father was black, from different types of experiences and references that they've had from other relatives. And, they were saying that they felt that they had come from the United States over the border.
And we're hoping also to incorporate the histories of the movement of enslaved people in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, to this larger database as well in Guatemala in connection.
It's part of the viceroyalty, right?
Yeah. You wanted to say something about that, Sabrina? No.
No, I lost the train of thought, so no.
That happened a lot.
I started thinking about lunch.
That's a good sign for us to transitioning into the lunch.